All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of our ongoing energy series, Pulling Back the Curtain, Who's Charting Our Energy Future? I'm June Blotnick, Executive Director of Clean Air NC, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our organization and the Sierra Club to today's session, Communities on the Frontline, which will be a panel discussion. We're very grateful to Nancy LaPlaca, energy policy expert, who's been leading this essential and timely series for energy advocates. We also want to thank today's panelists for sharing their lived experience and expertise on this important topic. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy now. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Yes, thanks to everyone for taking your valuable time to join us. And thanks also to our panelists for, as June said, sharing their lived experience. It's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists who've joined us right now. Daisha Williams is with Clean Air Carolinas. We've got Jorden Revels, and he's with NC Warren. And unfortunately, Danielle Kuntz from Maryland, University of Maryland, couldn't join us today. And we are waiting on William Barber III. So I'd like to kick it off too by...
I'm here.
Oh, very good. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Will, as everyone calls you. Right? So good to see you. So we were going to start off with Daisha, and this is all being recorded, everyone, so it's available, and we're not going to have our panelists come for another session at 5:30, so this will be the only session. And thank you again, panelists, and let's start with Daisha.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a thumbs up if that looks okay. Great. Awesome. So yes, I am Daisha Williams, Environmental Justice Manager for Clean Air NC now, actually, formerly Clean Air Carolina. And I've been working in the environmental justice space for a few years now, starting in college. And this is just a little bit of my background and my story. But my first position was as a donor communications assistant for a nonprofit called Wine to Water, which sold wine and used profits for water infrastructure projects in communities suffering from subpar drinking water. And then once I graduated in 2018, I moved to Seattle and I worked as a legislative assistant, where I primarily conducted workshops in Title I schools and in underserved communities for the purpose of educating about our legislative system and the ways in which these communities can have their voice heard. But my recent position before this one was as a stormwater specialist, where I worked on a grant with Johnson C. Smith University, which is the historically Black college here in Charlotte, for the purpose of empowering citizens of the historic West End with a voice and role in municipal stormwater program goals. And I bring up all of these positions not only because it's my background working in environmental justice spaces, but you can also really start to see a trend of how social, economic, and environmental factors affect low-income and BIPOC communities. So whether I was working in the policy or stormwater space, or now as I'm working in the air space, at the end of it, it's typically a disadvantaged community being impacted. And I say that because the issues transcend what we're here to talk about today. We have to continue to educate ourselves and to bring ourselves to these spaces to end this cycle. But with all of that being said, I'd like to get into our topic today, which is energy insecurity and energy burden, which is just another issue that impacts low income and communities of color across the nation and in our state. So energy insecurity, broadly defined as a situation where a household has difficulty meeting their energy needs. And this could be having difficulty paying for electricity bills, natural gas, or other utilities. And when people are faced with this situation, it has a lot of cascading effects in terms of well-being. And it's just a very real material hardship that communities face, or individuals, I should say. And then energy insecurity is linked to a sister concept, which is energy burden. And that is when low-income households spend a larger portion of their income on energy costs. cost. So just to illustrate this a little bit, this table on the slide provided by the NC Clean Energy Plan by the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, displays income tiers in our state and the share of energy burden associated with each tier. So as you can see, for those living with incomes below 50% of the poverty level, 33% of their annual income on average is spent on energy bills. And in total, 1.4 million people in North Carolina are living with unaffordable energy bills, a majority of which fall within the lowest income tiers. So we're really starting to see the issue of energy injustice, which arises when certain communities are more impacted by others, or through the social, economic, and health factors associated with the energy system. And diving into this a little bit more, as you can see, the burden is not evenly shared, where Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities all have disproportionately higher energy burdens than their white counterparts. And this graphic is provided by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. But just moving on, in North Carolina specifically, as you can see from the map provided on the right, from the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan again, the high energy burden falls mostly within the eastern part of our state, where there are other existing environmental concerns such as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. But this is a problem for many reasons. So for families and individuals and communities that experience this year round, high energy burdens make it harder to care for oneself or for someone's family. Because this typically forces already struggling families and individuals to make choices between paying energy bills or buying food, medicine, and other essentials. And just building on that, I briefly mentioned that high energy burden creates cascading effects. And this is because it can contribute to the cycle of poverty. So families with high energy burdens run the risk of having their utility service cut off if they can't afford to pay their bill. And the loss of utility service is actually a huge contributing factor for homelessness, especially for families with children. Just adding to that, the lack of working utilities is also a common reason that child welfare agencies remove children from their homes. And also individuals with unaffordable utility bills may be forced to take out high interest payday loans to pay off their bills, contributing to a cycle of debt that's harder to escape. So these impacts really compound on each other. And just to further compound this, many energy burden communities are also affected by the environmental and health risks associated with the fossil fuel industry and other industries that participate in environmentally destructive practices to generate and accumulate resources for energy. So in this way, energy insecurity and energy burden is not a singular threat, it's a cumulative risk where there are multiple factors contributing to the impact.
Daisha, this is June. We've had a request for you to just slow down just a little bit. It's a lot of information.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, thanks,
Okay.
Daisha. And since we don't have Danielle, everybody's got a little more time because this is great info. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll slow down a little bit. So how did we get here? When we think about the understandings of energy burden, the policy understanding and just the political understanding in general have mostly been reduced to economic hardship stemming from poverty. But when we talk about clean energy and affordable housing, what often gets left out of the conversation are the ways in which environmental issues and racist housing policies and practices intersect. And I'm specifically talking about redlining and other discriminatory housing practices that have been one of the foundational reasons communities of color and low-income communities have been saddled with persistent environmental problems, including energy burden. So when redlining practices began, affected communities, namely Black communities, were refused loans or insurance due to them living in an area deemed to be poor financial risk. So these policies often sanctioned, that were sanctioned actually by federal and state agencies, prevented Black communities from building wealth through home ownership, inducing them to become renters, while also preventing them from escaping neighborhoods with deteriorating infrastructure and poor environmental conditions. Redlining was ultimately banned under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but the legacy persists and continues to shape the experiences of people of color. So when we're talking about energy burden, this legacy shows in the lack of access to high quality housing structures. And this is important to bring up because energy inefficient homes lead to inefficient uses of energy, which increases the cost of performing basic household functions, such as lighting, heating, and cooling. And just building on this a little bit more, many of the nation's historically redlined districts now contain the hottest areas in the United States. And this is according to a recent study of data collected from 108 cities across the countries by researchers, sorry, excuse me, that's my dog, at the Science Museum of Virginia and Portland State University. So we're not just talking about inefficient homes here, but factors such as increased heat, which contribute to higher energy bills because of these practices. So I don't have this on the slide, but I do want to mention this. It makes many of these households with limited options. So usually they either have to confront high energy burden as a result of utilizing energy services through perhaps taking out a loan or seeking other financial avenues like I mentioned, or they're forced to contend with uncomfortable conditions to save money. So some people will turn off their heating or cooling to save energy costs. That creates health issues. Or they seek cheaper alternatives for heating and cooling and other utilities. And all of these options combined, alone or combined, the economic, physical, and coping hardships associated with energy insecurity pose critical challenges for affected households over time and intergenerationally, which is a big point. So in this way, it becomes pretty clear that energy insecurity and burden, the pathway emerges from a history of racist policies that perhaps most enduringly has persisted through poor housing conditions. And this vicious cycle can be interrupted by improvement in the overall quality of housing and energy efficiency in homes. And this can be accomplished through weatherization and energy efficiency upgrades, which can mitigate the effects of long-term exposure to housing and household energy-related stressors, particularly among our most vulnerable North Carolina communities like we've been talking about. So weatherization is the practice of protecting a building and its interior from elements, particularly sunlight, participation, wind, and other elements, and then modifying the building to reduce energy consumption and to optimize energy efficiency. So the process of weatherization begins with a comprehensive assessment of the energy infrastructure to identify any structural deficiencies present in the home, and then these deficiencies are addressed through repairing and replacing existing infrastructure. And then another way is through investments in energy efficiency measures. So while weatherization primarily refers to upgrades to the foundational structure of the home, energy efficiency measures can refer to both enhancements made to any non-structural items within the home, as well as any effort to improve energy efficiency. So perhaps improving appliances, and these measures help to reduce end-use loss of energy and are just as important as weatherization in reducing overall household energy burden. So just kind of wrapping that up, by improving housing quality, energy efficiency can begin the process of restorative justice for populations that have long been impacted by substandard housing conditions. However, as you might have guessed, and I'm sure you know, these types of remediation projects cost money. And when we're talking about low-income individuals who can't afford their utility bills, there's a great chance they can't afford to pay for home improvements at this level. So they have to depend usually on federal, state, or local programs. And unfortunately, a lot of the current policy solutions, as well as some programs to address energy insecurity, while some of them have good intent, they are inadequate or don't fully address the issue as a whole. So I just wanted to point out some of these. So starting with the North Carolina Weatherization Assistant Program, it aims to reduce energy costs for low-income households by increasing energy efficiency in their homes. They actually also too just started a solar program that communities can participate in a community solar program. And those who participate in this program are also provided with weatherization services such as insulation, sealing, appliance evaluations, and other projects that increase the efficiency. However, while this program with good intent, it has good intent. It doesn't account for the countless of low-income residents in North Carolina that are renters or that live in multi-unit family structures. And because of this status, they don't have the structural support, space, or freedom needed to install these systems and to be a part of this type of program. There's also grant programs such as the North Carolina Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which also allows municipalities to apply and design programs to meet community development needs of low to moderate income residents. And then similar to this type of program more recently in North Carolina, which some of you might are aware of, an on-bill financing program has been proposed as a solution to energy burden, specifically in the recent state energy bill, House Bill 951. And it's essentially a mechanism where financing repayments are made monthly through an existing utility bill. And this was introduced in HB 951 after well-founded scrutiny that this bill enacts several provisions that may increase the price of energy and primarily impact low to moderate income ratepayers. So once again, despite its inherent intent in providing critical relief to households in needs, energy bill assistance does not address the more enduring and structural consequences of energy insecurity. And adding to this, continuing to provide energy bill or cash assistance, especially to those with chronic need and dealing with this chronic issue, it can be costly for our government agencies if these types of programs are not paired with interventions that address the upstream causes of energy insecurity. So while this does not encompass all the programs addressing this at the state level, there's a clear need for better efforts towards energy justice. And then just in closing, I wanted to provide an example of a nonprofit that aims to address many of the issues I've talked about today in a community-led effort. A good example, if you will, just trying to close out on a little bit more of a positive note. But the Roanoke Membership Cooperative aims to address this dilemma with its Upgrade to Save program. So the cooperative is headquartered in Allander, North Carolina. It serves 8 counties, most of which have 20% or more residents living in poverty, and many of whom bear a high energy burden. So under this program, a customer contacts Roanoke and signs up for a free energy audit. And then the audit identifies cost-effective energy efficiency upgrades. And Roanoke sends a crew to the home to make upgrades at no cost. So instead of loaning members money and expecting them to pay it back, they finance the upgrades and secure the investment cost by adding a fixed tariff to the meter that is lower than the estimated energy savings. And then this fixed charge automatically transfers to future customers at a site until the initial investment is recovered in full. And thus far, according to their website, over 90% of the projects haven't required upfront investments from customers. So yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, provide a positive example of an organization that's trying to address this. And we hope that state programs and policies improve to be able to address this in a systematic way. There are opportunities to work with utilities, local and state governments, and utility commissions to set energy affordability goals and to track outcomes that identify programs that target these types of communities that really need this type of assistance. However, there's clearly a lot more work to do, but we applaud community initiatives and any efforts that seek to help customers shoulder their energy burdens. But yeah, that kind of wraps up my presentation, and I've just left my contact here for anyone that may want to utilize it. And I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Daisha. That was that was just wonderful and full of so much good information. I want to apologize. I forgot to tell everyone what the plan is for today. We're going to have each panelist is going to tell their story and tell us something about what they're working on. And each panelist is going to have about 15 minutes now that we don't have 4 panelists. We just have 3 now. And then we're going to go around a final round and get our panelists' recommendations for what we need to do in the future. And Daisha, I've been wanting that Roanoke program to expand. It's been there for years, and it's such a great program. It's co-ops, but we have so many co-ops we need to do that in. So Jorden, I want to introduce Jorden Revels from NC Warren. And Jorden, tell us your story and how you got here and what you're working on.
Yeah, most definitely. I appreciate that, Nancy. So Tanake, hey folks, my name is Jorden Revels. These pronouns he, they, them. And I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe from North Carolina. And I've been involved with a lot of the environmental justice movement, climate justice movement since I was about 18. I was a very, very fresh and green freshman in college when I first got pulled into the movement and really found a passion for the work of being able to do work, not only for my community, but a lot of different communities across North Carolina. And so I first got engaged in this movement against the fight against the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with this, this was a large-scale pipeline spanning from West Virginia through Virginia all the way down into my hometown, where the end connector site was in Prospect, North Carolina, which is Robeson County. And so this end connector site was about 1.5 miles from where I grew up and went to middle school, elementary school at, where I went to church at, where I lived at. And this is quite literally in the heart of Indian country for Robeson County. And so my advocacy started through the form of student government. And a lot of it was passing resolutions on campus coming out that the student body was against this construction of the pipeline, doing a lot of letters to representatives for students on campus, and a lot of tabling. And through that tabling process, very coincidentally and very luckily, I was able to meet my soon to become mentor, Miss Donna Chavis, who was a movement elder for not just environmental issues, but climate issues as well. As she was finishing up a walk with multiple people who were all opposing and protesting against the pipeline. And through that connection and getting to know her, I was able to secure an internship that would actually allow me to spend the entirety of my summer devoted towards environmental justice fights. And so from that point on, I got really engaged with helping educate folks through popular education, with engaging folks around this issue, coming out to hearing sessions by DEQ, DENR, and other regulatory entities, as well as helping engage multiple tribal communities across North Carolina against this fight. And it took a very long time, but luckily 2 years ago, we were actually able to stop the pipeline in its tracks. But despite us being able to stop that pipeline and what it represented, there is still such a damaging legacy that was intended for it that is still following through to this day, which I'll be talking about a little bit as I get into this short presentation. So part of my work at NC Warren is as a EDLI facilitator. EDLI stands for Energy Democracy Leadership Institute. And so what we do is we engage BIPOC communities that are also frontline communities in particular that are suffering from some major climate justice issues within North Carolina. Some of these include frac gas infrastructure, like the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and now what we're facing in Robeson County is the liquefied natural gas facility, which is a 1 billion cubic foot methane storage facility that is also being proposed and built in the middle of our community. Some other front lines include forest destruction. One of the very large growing issues is biomass production through wood pellets, such as companies like Enviva, which are basically proxy companies that are coming in, tearing down our forests en masse, and then turning them into wood pellets. So those wood pellets can be shipped back to countries like France and then burned off as an energy source. So it's a compounding issue, and I'll explain why that's even more problematic in the Southeast later in the presentation, as well as coal ash issues, most particularly coal ash as a result of Duke Energy continuing to use coal sources, but also failing to clean up its messes that have come about as a result of their coal ash usage. And so through EDLI, all of our participants are BIPOC, and most of them haven't really been engaged in any capacity for building leadership. So our goal is to help them not only get up to speed and understand these issues very intimately and how they impact folks, but also helping them revision a future that they wouldn't have imagined beforehand. Because oftentimes we're put in this situation where we believe that the only way we can really get our energy sources is going to be through something like Duke Energy. It's going to be through fossil fuels. But helping reimagine and help a community regain its autonomy and how it can perceive its own future that isn't really prescribed by another entity outside of it is really powerful, because the system by design is set up to pigeonhole us in these perspectives and not really allow us to create any new political imaginations for what our lives can look like. So part of the vision we have to create a just energy system comes from a localized perspective, one that helps create and develop more resilience with our community, is an energy system that is affordable and accessible to folks. Because current rates, as they continue to go up, up, and up, it's becoming more of a burden, not just an energy burden, but people are being priced out of being able to choose for air conditioning during the summer. People are being priced out of being able to have heating when it comes to the cold winter months, right? And so that's one of the important pillars that we also want to have in the future. We also think of an energy system that is democratically controlled and isn't going to be dependent on stakeholders who have millions and millions of dollars and ultimately don't have the concerns of everyday people in mind. And also, not quite the most important, but it is a big thing that needs to happen. We want to make sure these energy systems are based on renewable sources and we're not locked into fossil fuel infrastructure and coal as a means of being able to have this energy and to be able to live and have healthy lives. And so all these energy injustices are part of the same cycle. It's a compounding inequity that really pushes down on the communities that are most first and worst impacted by it. As you can see, it comes to a head with energy burden. It goes down into the lack of energy source because we're living in an energy monopoly by Duke Energy. We're continually suffering from having biomass taken away from our communities in the form of wood pellets. We're stuck in the vicinity and adjacency to fracked fossil fuel infrastructure. We're suffering from coal ash pollution, as well as the biogas and other runoff from CAFOs. As a result of all these compounding inequities, you see those compounded health outcomes and disparities that are present in our community. And so it's this giant pyramid that puts pressure all the way down, and at the very bottom would be us in the communities. So whether that's the economic injustice of not really having healthy jobs to go to and being forced to work in factories through industrialization, living in adjacency to these farms, I can literally drive 5 miles one direction within my county. And along that route, I can see multiple chicken farms, large scale farming facilities that have trailers in front of them, not even 100 feet away. I would argue to say even 50 feet away, right? And so that's the reality of what it looks like and how immediate and in your face that these issues are. And there's no strong regulations against that. I think it takes more permitting. Yeah, this is accurate. It takes more permitting to get a house in North Carolina than it does to get a chicken facility up and running for farming. Large-scale industrial chicken farms. So whereas up in the Northeast, there's a lot more CAFO issues in the form of hog and swine. Down in the Southeast, we're more concentrated on chicken issues, right? I used to think it was pretty normal for driving down the road and seeing a chicken truck or a hog truck. I was like, okay, yeah, everybody sees that. And then once I actually got out of Robeson County, I was like, I don't see any chicken or hog trucks here. What's up with that? It says the reality is a ramping up issue that we're being forced to lock into, but we don't really want to have to take this as it's ultimately harming and damaging our community in multiple ways. I'm not sure how well you all could see this, but this is one of the maps we use for EDLI in helping track out where we have participants, but also where these energy and environmental injustices are occurring, right? And so if you see these little orange blips, these are just swine animal operations. This is what it looks like. So you can see the disparity if you look up towards the north, the west, anywhere up north, it's a lot less concentrated. But when you get to the northeast, when you get to the southeast, you see how highly concentrated these facilities are and where those disparities lie. So I just wanted to give you a moment to really, I guess, depending on what you're viewing on, to squint or get a good look at all these dots to get an idea of how bad this is in the form of CAFOs. This is just for hog operations. This doesn't count chicken operations as well. You can also find the various coal ash ponds or biomass facilities that are in operation. This actually does need to be updated. I think this is about a year and a half old. There are more that have been proposed and in construction at this time. And so to go a little bit into the issue of the frac fuel infrastructure, I'm going to go back to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline shortly to discuss the impacts of this project, why it was so problematic, and what was the big picture scale where this fit in on the puzzle. So originally this was about a $4.1 billion project when it was first proposed. When I got on board in 2016, it was around that amount. And through the work we were able to do over time, we were able to jack that price up and up and up so that it was eventually just too expensive of a project for investors to go into. But the reason why this is so problematic is that it was a frac gas methane pipeline that was doing the fracking in West Virginia and carrying it all the way down here. And what makes this such a more damaging issue is that methane is about 80 to 100 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas for helping insulate and capture carbon dioxide. I'm sorry, it's that much more damaging than carbon dioxide because it insulates the heat in the atmosphere that much more. So whereas with a lot of carbon dioxide related fuel sources, there's a lot of sediment, right? So with coal production, there's a lot of coal ashes that is developed. The ash is basically captured. So there's no extra sediment with methane, but with coal, you have more of an impact environmentally with the ash that's produced. So they're worse in their own individual ways and not something we need to continue constructing or lock into. And so with this pipeline, it cut through multiple farmlands, neighborhoods, forests, and a lot of waterways down in North Carolina, as well as Virginia and West Virginia as well. So this was a huge risk to public health and safety. If you look at the amount of leakage that happens with pipelines, we know absolutely without a shadow of doubt that gas pipelines always leak. And you can see the infrared videos that people have captured across the country showing just how bad these leaks are when we're told that the reality There's, oh no, they don't leak, they don't do this, they don't do X, Y, and Z, while they are doing X, Y, and Z the entire time. So it was a huge risk to public health and safety, as well as the property that was being forcibly taken away by people who've lived on these lands for generations upon generations, and being told they have no choice but to give it up. And so this shows the disparity of the northeast and southeastern counties that it would cut through. Most of these being BIPOC communities, as well as in adjacency to many native tribes and communities. Had this project gone through, it would have impacted more native peoples than any other project in federal history. The disparity was literally that large, and you can see a lot of work that's been done by one of our scholars, Dr. Ryan Emanuel, about this topic to see the statistics and information used to display that. So the issue with these pipelines, the LNG and other fossil fuel infrastructures, is that they do intentionally target low-income communities of color. This project was going through the poorest regions of North Carolina. They were all eastern counties. They impacted indigenous peoples of the Lumbee, Haudenosaunee, Kahari, Tuscarora, and Maharan nations, as well as Black and African Americans, small farmers, and poor white folks with the false promise of jobs and economic development. In reality, this is a very short-lived job proposal within less of a year, because most of our people don't have the certifications or training to be able to continually work on these pipelines. And so getting us further away from the clean energy future we want to have, and having those clean energy jobs that we want to see produced in North Carolina to healthily and sustainably support folks. Actually, before I move on, I also want to talk about the LNG. So as I said, it was a 1 billion cubic foot storage facility that is currently being built in Wakulla, which is a native community down here in Robeson County. And so part of this issue is, I think of it like dominoes, right? So we have the ACP and we have the LNG. We knocked one domino completely off the table, thankfully, but when these dominoes go off, it's a chain reaction, right? So where one project is approved and able to be constructed, multiple projects are soon to be proposed after that, if not already in proposal states, to be locked in along that route, right? And so this is why it's so important for us to be continually stopping these issues, because where they get away with one, they can also get away with 5 more, right? Because we're being forced to lock into these energy sources so that we're continually dependent on them for the next, at a minimum, 10 to 15 years, so the projects expire and the shale sources have been retired. And so that's continually locking us in a future that is not healthy, that is not safe, and is ultimately not where we need to be at if we want to be on track for all our goals and mitigate the damage by climate change. And to give you an idea of what CAFOs look like, especially here in the Southeast and Northeast, these are the animal feeding operations. As you can see, you have the animal storage facilities here, and in the back you have waste pools where a lot of the waste that's produced is held and kept. And while ideally this wouldn't become a problem because they're supposed to be contained here, realistically what happens is there's oftentimes a lot of leakage, whether it's cracks within the pool itself or as a result of the increasing natural disasters that we're facing, such as the impacts from Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence. You see a lot of overflow into river systems, aquifers, and other waterways, which is incredibly damaging when you consider the bacteria that has been exposed to antibiotics, the level of antibiotics, right? So basically superbugs are being introduced into raw ecosystems that have never experienced them. You're also looking at a lot of pollution from just the bacteria and disease that is in these waste pools getting into waterways that people use for recreation, that people use for sustenance, and being able to provide for their families with, as well as with ceremony. So there's all these compounding issues as to why the increased expansion of CAFOs is so very problematic, especially when it's in such unbridled and uncontrolled, unregulated fashion as it is. So as you can see here, this is an image of what these CAFOs look like while they're flooded. I think it was during Hurricane Matthew in particular. When the storm came through, you would see video footage and photos of hogs literally just stranded on top of these buildings. And a good amount of them dying, and also a festering way to create disease. And there's really nothing significant being done about it, right? And so there's all these compounding issues with CAFOs that come to a head and ultimately cause them to be so disastrous for our community. And lastly, I'm going to talk about this just to bring things full circle with how natural gas infrastructure and CAFO productions are compounding with forest destruction. And so the wood pellet industry is very damaging. A lot of our IADLE participants were actually directly impacted by these projects by Enviva. A lot of them had developed things like asthma and other respiratory symptoms as a result of being in adjacency to these projects. And another compounding issue when looking at how we're impacted by the climate issues is that the purpose of trees, especially in wetlands and swamp areas, the goal is to retain water, right? To retain the sediment within the area. So what happens when you're logging these forests in mass, right? There's no longer anything holding that water together. And so when storms do come through, when hurricanes are coming through and causing flooding, it's that much more exponentially worse because there's nothing holding in place anymore, right? And so when that runoff comes to a local town, community, or comes to a river as it's cresting, you're causing that issue to be that much more worse. And so with increased production of Enviva facilities, also fuel infrastructure facilities, as well as CAFOs, you're seeing all of this forest destruction compounding within it, right? So it's not just an issue of us losing the thing that is causing sequestration and pulling carbon dioxide out of there, but also worsening the impacts of climate disasters in communities that are already first and worst impacted. It's compounding it to be that much worse in the future. And so with that, I'm pretty much wrapped up. I appreciate it.
Jorden, thank you so much. That was amazing. What a story. What a story. And so glad that you ended up in the EJ world. That was an incredible presentation. So next we've got Will Barber. And Will almost needs no introduction, especially for North Carolina folks. And so I hear that your father is Mr. Barber, but you're Will. So Will, if you could tell us about your story, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Nancy. William Barber III here. Will or William is fine. You know, very glad to be on and see many friendly faces, being involved in this work for quite a while. My father, Bishop William J. Barber II, of course, has been a social justice advocate in the state, you know, for quite a while as well, with his work with the NAACP at one time, as well as the Poor People's Campaign more recently. My role, I've served as an environmental and climate justice scholar and advocate. I have approximately a decade social justice organizing experience and deep academic training in the science and the law behind environmental and climate issues. I received my Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Physics from North Carolina Central University, earned my Juris Doctorate from the University of North Carolina, where I focused on environmental law and policy. I currently work as the Strategic Partnerships Manager at the Climate Reality Project. But I also more recently have founded the Rural Beacon Initiative, LLC, which is a multi-member startup. And we focus on consultation for groups that are looking to advance equity, climate justice, and environmental justice through policy. I come through this work really with a deep appreciation for self-determination for frontline communities. Daisha and Jorden did an excellent job of laying out the landscape in terms of the problem of environmental justice, kind of the legacies. I want to talk a little bit more about the forward thinking. What does that call us to do? And how did I get in this work? So as I mentioned, I'm very passionate about self-determination for communities, specifically how investments in clean energy can result in increased self-determination for communities that have historically been shut out of the conversation, as Daisha and Jorden, so eloquently relayed. When we talk about the histories of redlining, talk about the histories of environmental injustice, talk about the histories, systemic poverty, systemic racism, and the very prevalent realities today of the disruption that's happening. You look at the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which Jorden mentioned, and I was very proud to be able to stand with him and others, Donna Chavis and others from the area in that fight. Talk about the disruption that's planned now with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Talk about the disruption that's being planned now in the Gulf South, where fossil fuel facilities are attempting to extend their lifetimes by switching from energy generation and emissions to now creating a really a detrimental market around plastics and petrochemical production. When you talk about these legacies of yesteryear, but also the current realities, it puts a real lens that frontline communities, communities of color, rural communities have to be a part of the equation, not just how we include them in the conversation, but how do we actually position them to move along as a new clean energy economy is being built? And within that conversation, how do we do that in a way where we're not just identifying those communities as either new markets to be exploited, or as passive groups on whose behalf we must have to act, but how do we see them as full-fledged participants, full-fledged individuals, full-fledged leaders in these economies? I say it in this way: how do we think about the opportunities for ownership, community ownership? How do we think about how do we restructure our supply chains? How do we think about, when we go as a state, as a nation, the next few decades, and see the billions of dollars that are going to be placed into climate remediation? What are the clear, concrete places we can say this went into frontline communities' hands? This went to see new economic opportunities, communities of color, and poor communities. Right now in the Build Back Better infrastructure plan, there's proposed over $555 billion for climate remediation, including a $27 billion carve out for a federal climate accelerator that will hopefully serve as an engine to drive towards the administration's Justice 40 initiative. $555 billion. That's massive. That's generational transformation of our economy. And it has the potential to be generational transformation in terms of advancing equity, but only if we put the lens and address the disparities that currently exist in the clean energy economy. What do I mean? Well, right now, we know, talked about the energy burden, for example. We know that there's racial disparity that exacerbates energy poverty, but there's also racial disparity when we talk about who's actually benefiting from this shift to clean energy. In 2019, there was a report done by the National Nonpartisan Business Group, Environmental Entrepreneurs, that looked and said that there, in 2019, were more than 113,000 North Carolinians who were working in clean energy. That's great. It's absolutely great. However, the report further showed there was deep inequity when it came to who actually was benefiting, seeing personal financial rewards from those jobs. we saw that in that report further on said that the percentage of white solar installers, about 55%. There was the percentage of Latino solar installers, about 32%. And only about 6% of solar installers were Black, compared to 13%, representing 13% of the entire nation's population. An even greater disparity when you talk about indigenous representation. Similar disparity when you talk about women installers. So on the front end, while our policy is seeking to address climate for all of us, there is already bleeding in, because of those existing disparities, an inequity that we have to be very conscious of. I can talk about the science, I can talk about the environmental justice components, but in today's conversation, as we're thinking forward thinking, I would encourage us to think about the dollars, the resources, the concrete benefits that advance equity, not just using equity as a buzzword, or not just making the mistake that equity is simply representation, right? It's not just having a panel with, communities of color join the conversation. Equity is what resources are we seriously putting into communities that are community controlled, that lead to economic sustainability for these communities, and position them to be full-fledged participants and, dare I say, competitors in a new clean energy economy. I'm very passionate about this work because as a native of Eastern North Carolina, I grew up witnessing the strength, the resilience, the dignity that we see in frontline communities. With the background, Black, Indigenous, and white in my family, so having that legacy, multiracial legacy, I grew up seeing that being a through line. I grew up hearing stories of legacy and innovation that was shared amongst families that had often lived and worked on land in areas for generations, often in the face of incredible societal challenge. So I took inspiration for these stories, and it always, for me, carved this clear lens that there, frontline communities too often are lumped into this narrative of victimhood. We think about poor communities and we say, oh, look at the victims. We think about communities of color and say, oh, look at the victims. We think about communities on the front lines of the climate and environmental crisis. We say, oh, look at the victims. However, we must understand that this narrative of victimhood is detrimental, and we really have to flip it on its head. These communities are impacted not because of a lack of innovation, a lack of ability. They have been impacted because of generations of bad policy that have been enacted on our behalf as society. We have done this to communities. And that's something we have to wrestle with. When you talk about the legacy of redlining that was mentioned earlier, which resulted in our nation's most polluting infrastructure being targeted in communities that had been deemed as less desirable, less valuable, less able to fight back, kind of the lowest points of entry. We've done that. When you talk about the fact that that legacy of fossil fuel infrastructure is the only reason that we're in a global climate crisis now, have to recognize we have done that. You talk about the fact that there's a great travesty of that, because those same communities that have for generations borne the adverse health impacts, the hits to the ability to build generational wealth for Black and poor communities, have actually contributed the least to fossil fuel demand. Why? Because we know that poor communities per capita consume less energy per capita than median income and affluent families. So they have actually contributed the least in terms of the demands for detrimental fossil fuel infrastructure that has gotten us to where we are. But the great tragedy is that even though they've contributed the least and have borne those impacts for generations, they still find themselves on the front lines being hit first and worst by a climate crisis. We have done that. And it's only once we acknowledge our responsibility through policy, our responsibility, society as a whole, by having these blind spots, that we can craft movements and solutions that speak to those realities. You know, one of my most pertinent memories when we talk about this work is that of participating in the North Carolina Poverty Tour back in 2012. At the time, I was a student at North Carolina Central University. I was in the environmental physics program. I was planning my career trajectory to actually go into renewable energy engineering. Happened to be in a laboratory one day and was doing, you know, a really abstract exercise like calculating light at the center of an atom, and was saying, like, how is this actually going to translate to any social good? You know, who is this going to help? The people I care about. And so at this moment of crisis, the North Carolina Poverty Tour was launched in response to one of our state legislators going on public record in 2012 and saying that he did not believe that extreme poverty existed in the state at that time. So just erasing, right? A couple of million North Carolinians. We know that right now, speaking of energy burden, nearly 1.4 million North Carolinians receive utility bills that they can't afford every year, right? So just erasing, you know, a couple million North Carolinians. And so North Carolina NAACP, my father was president at the time, and the UNC Center for Poverty came together and said, we were going to challenge this. They were going to challenge this by going to some of the most egregious areas of poverty in the state and disrupt what they called attention violence, where you kind of, by making an issue anonymous, you basically erase and saying, oh, you lump everyone, oh, the poor. And so it never really gets talked about. And so they went to some of these areas and put faces, names, and stories with the issue of poverty in North Carolina. Well, one of the stops along that tour was Navaso, North Carolina. It's a small town in eastern North Carolina that was once a vibrant community. It actually has a history of being a freedmen community, if some of you all are familiar with what that is. So basically an area where formerly enslaved individuals went to develop community, to grow, to work, to raise families, largely undisturbed, once a freedmen community, with over, and it's a beautiful area. You know, the Cape Fear River cuts through it, serves as a natural deep sea port. Talk about access to green space, seems prime for development. The community could not develop because a wood processing plant came in and poisoned over 600 acres of land in the heart of this community. June, I see you nodding. You're familiar with this story. Were some of the worst carcinogens known to man, still listed as a Superfund site. And as we were talking to individuals, getting their stories, there was a woman kind of standing on the edge of the crowd and just kind of watching. We asked if she wanted to come forward and speak. She said, no, let me just kind of watch. She just was very thoughtful. And as we were loading up people back on the buses, getting ready to leave, she came forward in the center of the crowd and a tear comes to her eye. Long story short, she says, you know, I want to thank you all for coming out here to see about us. A lot of people don't come out here, don't care about us out this way. And I had to watch you all before I felt comfortable in sharing my story. She said, I grew up in this community. I was one of a family of 13 siblings, or excuse me, 16 siblings. And she pointed to the house where her mother and father raised it. She said, as a result of the poison that was placed in this land, in this earth, 13 out of 15 of my siblings contracted the same cancer and had since died. And I'm not ashamed to say, I tell everyone everywhere I go that story, that was the moment that my activism shifted. Because again, when we look at the impact that what we have done in terms of bad policy, that was a clear example of that. Clear example of the environmental harm that we caused. And I say that to put urgency on the moment of where we are now, when we see such clear focus on addressing these issues, when we see the level of resources and investment that are being put forth in unprecedented levels to address the issues, because now it's out of hand. Now people are recognizing the full scale of this environmental and climate crisis. When we see $555 billion, like we say, carved out, bipartisan support, even though we still have work to do, but carved out, ambitious, that we can solve this, we cannot let it be lost in our attempts to address these issues quickly, the harm that we have done. And we desperately need coalition, leaders, policymakers, young, old, Black, white, indigenous, if we're going to make the most of this moment, to articulate we can no longer play these games with solutions. We can no longer say we have to address climate at the expense of community. We have to acknowledge the harm that we have done and push for solutions that look at innovation, that look at putting real resources into communities, that look at when we see extractive areas that have traditionally been locked into extractive economies. How do we not just build clean infrastructure elsewhere, not just the urban areas, not just the places where it's obviously needed, but how do we bring along fully communities that have borne the brunt of this crisis up to this point? And if we do that, if we think about opportunities for community ownership, if we think about revisiting justice precedents that have spoken to us about how we advance this, everything from the 17 principles of environmental justice to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to the unratified Escasa Agreement, there is ample information on how we can come up with solutions that push our thinking to really have a new imagination of what's possible. And we have the resources to do this. We have the opportunity to do this. The question is, do we have the will to begin to do this? And so that's a lot of the work that I'm hoping to be involved in is, again, how do we think through new solutions, to create models of innovation. For Rural Beacon Initiative, we look at the intersection of sustainable agriculture, energy generation, and affordable housing as an opportunity to create sustainability hubs that could then be deployed in LMI and BIPOC communities as a way to show what is possible in these areas, but to also, again, offer these economic underpinnings from which additional development, additional resources, additional services can come. And so with that, I'll end. Don't want to do a full slideshow because I know we're on time, but I do want to share 3 slides that really inform the urgency of our work. So this is really our bread and butter. No, I don't want to do that. I just want to. Normally I would go through a lot of this, but I really just want to do these 3 slides. Let me see. I think I keep hitting play from start, play from current slide. Here we go. So this is the unique overlays that shows why, when we talk about leadership in the Southeast, and why we have to understand the intersections of these issues. This represents census data that looks at the concentrations, populations of Black or African-American populations by county. And if you notice the hotspotting, you'll know, and if you're a student of history, you'll know that this area here in the Southeast, it corresponds to an area that's known as the Black Belt. Unfortunately, as I'm reminded by many of my public health colleagues, it also corresponds with an area known as the Stroke Belt, seeing some of the most, egregious health disparities in the nation. you look at this overlay, and this overlay represents the distribution of what is known as persistent poverty in the nation. Persistent poverty being when you look at a child born into an impoverished family, what is the likelihood that that child would have the opportunity and the ability to end up in an economic position better than their family? And you see, Southeast also shows some of the most egregious hotspotting areas. The darker colors represent cases where that is likely not to be the case, where there's a greater chance that that child will be in an economic position worse off, at the same level or worse than their family. And then finally, this is a more recent data set that looks at the frequency of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters from 1980 to 2019. And you see the hotspotting is in areas in which we're very much familiar. You see North Carolina, you see the Gulf South, you see your Louisiana, you see your Florida. These are the places of impact. So what is the story here? Well, this overlays, when you look at them in tandem, again, look at the overlays. Communities of color, Black or African-American populations, persistent poverty communities, and areas that are suffering from the greatest frequency of billion-dollar weather climate disasters. When we think about who is on the front lines of climate disaster as it is occurring right now, these communities are largely communities of color, largely in the Southeast, and are largely poor. So it paints a narrative of the identity of these communities that then needs to be reflected in our policy of who and how we prioritize. What do we prioritize when we talk about mitigating this crisis? And this data set very simply speaks to a larger issue that when we're talking about solving the climate crisis, what we do to advance and sustain frontline communities is going to bode how well we're able to solve this crisis for all of us. What we allow to happen on the front lines is going to be a direct precursor, reflection, if you will, for what is going to happen for all of us. And I'll close by saying, you know, the fact of the matter is, the hope is that there is hope. We know that when we look at the deployment of clean energy technology, we have the resources, the ability to do that. Already for 2/3 of the planet, renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy generation. We know that the Earth receives more energy from the sun every hour than humanity uses in a year. We know that through effective deployment of wind energy could generate the Earth's electricity needs 40 times over. We know that we can work with communities to seek new models of community ownership, community access, like the Pay As You Save program, which was implemented in Roanoke Chowan Electric Cooperative. We can look at those new models and we can expand them, draw visibility around them. We can solve this, y'all. We can solve this. We know that although the climate crisis represents an unprecedented crisis on a scale that no one sector can solve it alone, government can't solve it alone, nonprofit can't solve it alone, private finance can't solve it alone, community activism can't solve it alone. But by breaking those silos down and thinking collectively about the opportunity and the urgency to see the intersections and build solutions accordingly, that we can really, really, really advance solutions to these issues. And so with that, I've taken up too much time, but I will close and say, very good to be a part of this conversation, and very committed to working with each and every one of you all to positioning our community and our state to be a leader on these issues. So thankful for the words and the activism that's present on the call.
Excellent.
Wow, thank you so much, Will. And yeah, we're going to go a little bit over. And June, jump in if you have anything to say. I wanted to see if we could ask Daisha and Jorden and Will for just what if you could get anything you want. how would you change those policies? And I want to say, Will, that having been part of government and advocacy for decades, it breaks my heart that we never did these policies. All these policies have been there for so long and we've never done them, you know. So let's start with Daisha. What would you do if you could wave a magic wand?
Well, I would do a lot of things, but I really think in terms of just concrete solutions, Will really hit it on the head. And I'll just say that I don't think we'll ever be able to be successful in this movement for a healthy, safe, and sustainable planet for everyone if we don't intentionally and actively fight to dismantle racism in all of its forms. And within that, like Will touched upon, is actively seeking out the involvement, and within that too, perspectives of impacted communities, because they're the true experts of living on the front line and the issues that we've talked about today. And I mentioned briefly some of the ways environmental problems affect low-income BIPOC communities and how that issue transcends across multiple areas of concern. And then Jorden too touched upon being locked into fossil fuel energy sources and furthering the impact on climate and communities. So taking all of this into account, I feel as though if we address structural racism and inequity and the way that we combat the climate crisis and solve environmental issues, we can mitigate and eventually stop this cumulative impact that frontline communities have been experiencing. And this is especially important to take into account when you look at the landscape of what's going on right now. You see BIPOC communities being hit disproportionately by COVID-19, energy burden, like we talked about, the climate crisis, like we talked about, white supremacy, state-sanctioned economic deprivation, and just so much more. So I feel as though we really need to take all of these racial disparities in account when we are pushing solutions through and pushing policies through for the climate crisis, because we're going to continue to leave these communities behind, as Will pointed out, if we don't do so. But yeah.
Thanks, Daisha. And Jorden, what are your words? What would you do?
Yeah, in line with what Daisha said, definitely would do a lot of things. One in particular I feel called to talk about right now would be dismantling the stakeholder structure for a lot of corporations, fossil fuel entities, as well as utilities. Really breaking that down completely. So the priority is not stakeholders first, but rather the people who are being served, people who are being given services. Because ultimately it's that pool of capital that twists the focus. Instead of being people, services, and just being helpful, it's how do we extract and abuse as much as possible so we can maximize profits. So I would definitely get rid of that structure immediately and open up the ability for community people, everyday folks, to actually be a part of that process rather than stakeholders who don't even live in the state or in like 5 tax brackets above the high median in the area, you know.
And Will, any last words?
Yeah, a couple of things in terms of, policy. I think, first things is we have to make sure we're putting pressure on decision makers to pass and hold the line on federal infrastructure bills like we're seeing with the BBB and like that will likely be in the future. We have to make sure that these resources, these policies have clear, articulated equity and environmental justice goals, not abstractly that we will advance equity or EJ, but clear metrics on how that becomes operationalized, which would include, as a part of rulemaking at the federal and state level, mandated programs that have explicit carve-outs for EJ and frontline communities, for diversity in procurements and contracts and supply chains. We just like we set metrics for emissions generation, we need to be setting metrics for environmental justice and equity goals. Who needs to benefit? If after 30 years, we look at the dollars that have flowed through the federal government and through the states and cannot point to the clear channels newly created that flow directly into communities, we've missed the point.
Mhm.
If we also have to look at opportunities for community ownership, like what's happening in in Roanoke Chowan Electric Cooperative, like with the PAYS program, like with challenging the investor-owned utility monopolies, right? And really advancing conversations around third-party generation, solar generation, because that creates economic opportunity for so many who have historically been locked out of the conversation. If we recreate this economy and drop emissions down to zero, but put in place the same channels, distributions that got us in this mess in the first place, we've missed the point. And then finally, I would say we need to look at, really make sure we're expanding our thinking on what solutions to climate look like beyond just energy generation, energy storage, and lowering of emissions. We need to have conversations around nature-based solutions and access to green space, and what are the co-benefits that exist there. We need to talk about how do we revamp our agricultural systems, even looking at more sustainable forms of agriculture. We need to talk about access for communities when we think about clean energy technology. So not only like generating facilities, but battery storage. How do we address issues around economic encumbrances to access? Talk about zero emissions transportation. How do we facilitate expanding access in that regard, both in terms of infrastructure and pricing for communities? So we really have to have a robust conversation. And finally, I think we have to have a commitment. And this is where I think movement has to serve as the impetus. The citizens have to serve as an impetus, is that as we're looking through each of these lenses, we have to look at the intersections, how they intersect and manifest amongst other issues, and really, really, really build our thinking or change our thinking as such. So.
Well, Nancy, did you want to add something?
I want to add that just that being involved in the PUCs for a couple decades now, it stuns me that we don't even look at environmental impacts. Oh, that's not considered. It's a tragedy. It's just a tragedy, and that must change also. I want to thank everyone. And June, can you tell us about the state of the climate that's coming up?
Yeah, I will in 1 second. We have really been fortunate to have these 3 speakers today. Yes. And I want to thank each of them. You have really, for those of us that knew the issues, you've just brought it all back, and it feels like a burden, but it's not. It's an opportunity to change our economy and our people's lives. I'm just thinking, in April, we'll be planning or sponsoring our NC Breathe conference, which Will spoke at, which Jorden spoke at. And it's like we need to tell it again, but I'm just wondering, the theme of that conference is health, equity, and the climate crisis. And I'm wondering how to make that conference follow the themes that we brought out today. And one of the things I told our policy manager is, we're environmentalists, we're policymakers. We need to be business developers, if we're going to change the economy. And I think Will knows this, 25 years ago or more, what was it, 30 years ago, we started the self-help credit union when all the textile mills were leaving Eastern North Carolina and the state, and created a pool of money to enable more ownership. But we've got to sort of take that to the next level and really do our own investment, because the banks weren't doing it. But y'all raised so many great points today, and Nancy and I have been taking notes, but let's take away from this conversation what's next. Let's keep visualizing what does that future look like? When you're seeing the future we want, what are the components of that? You know, and we'll, of course, we have to find the strategies and policies to get there, but just keep that in the forefront of your mind and your hearts as we move forward on this journey together. So thank you all so much. Clean Air NC tomorrow will hold our annual State of the Climate event. And it's a day for people to give back to support Clean Air Carolina in our work, but it's also a time where we'll be giving Blue Sky awards to 3 different awards tomorrow night to individuals and groups that have partnered with us this year on climate work, as well as a panel discussion on climate and health. So please check out the link that Nancy put in the chat. And I'm sorry we didn't get to folks' questions, but you will have access to the recording today. And Jorden, if it's okay for you to share your slides, Will, if you want to share those 3 slides, that'd be great. It's all really helpful to all of us as we move forward together. And with that, I want to wish you all a good rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.